In our talks, we have used the word culture, we have used the word education, we have used the word civil society. And I myself, I think it's not just part of my trade, it's part of my studies, I guess it's also part of my interest. I'm always interested in the etymology of words, and first and foremost I need to know who exactly defines those words, not just in the realm of politics, but also in the realm of culture. Why I'm saying this? Because the word culture nowadays has become omnipotent and sort of a disarming word. Everybody uses this word.
Yeah.
In America, for instance, you have drug culture, you have lesbian culture, you have meth culture, you have methadone culture, meth culture, hash culture, cinema culture. So the more we use this word, the more we risk losing its original meaning. I'm particularly sensitive to it because I was born in ex-communist Yugoslavia, where the word democracy was regurgitated on all wavelengths 24 hours a day. So with all due respect, yes, I'm aware of the fact that we need such a glorious, such pompous title like the basis of culture, and I will be talking about this, and in education as well. But first and foremost, we need to know exactly who defines those words and in which context. Take, for instance, if I can just digress a little bit, the word culture, what it meant in England, or what it meant in Great Britain in the 19th century. I'm particularly enamored with the German word Kultur and Kulturkampf. We have translated it somewhat awkwardly into cultural battle or culture struggle, which is not exactly the original meaning of the German word Kulturkampf. Why I'm using this word Kulturkampf, which has a special resonance in the German ears, because Kulturkampf and Kulturträger, those words, Kulturträger can roughly be translated as bearers, culture bearers. Those words, those notions had a significant meaning in the first half of the 19th century in Germany, because those words, those concepts, they laid down the foundations of the future German national consciousness. Kulturträger and Kulturkampf. And in fact, those words were later on implemented all over continental Europe. Certainly not so much in France and in England as in Poland, for instance, in Croatia, where we also use in our Croatian language the word Kulturträger, culture bearer. To some extent, if I can just, hark back to what our friend Adrian Davies said a while ago, Kulturträger were those young people, of course the word, the construct, cultural hegemony did not exist back in the early 19th century, this word, this locution. But basically those Kulturträger in Germany, just try to imagine a little bit the landscape of Germany in the early 19th century. Those were itinerant poets, and of course library-bound philosophers, Dichter and Denker as the Germans called them, who laid the foundation of the German identity. Now Germany back then was not a state, it was just split up in little statehoods, little niches, actually it was not a centralized state as France was back then. Now, the same semantic aberrations we can observe also with the word education. And please do excuse me if I'm a little bit too critical about this word education. For instance, in the American English, and I'm sure you're aware of that, people often say, oh, my son needs to get education. My daughter needs to get education. And I sometimes wonder, gee, what's going on? Is this a perishable commodity? Why do you have to get education? But unfortunately, let's admit on a somewhat pessimistic note, yes, unfortunately, education has become a perishable commodity, a very liquid type of a substance, if any substance, in our modern liquid times. Another lexical and I think also a conceptual problem, let alone also a judicial problem, and a nightmare, judicial nightmare, comes with another neologism. Probably you may be aware of it, probably not. And this is the word multicultural, multicultural. I don't know how many of you realize this word actually surfaced in American academia on campuses in the late 70s. Now we take it for granted, both in our legal system, in our political, in our media, mainstream media here in the UK or in France. Yet keep in mind that this word multicultural has no etymological basis whatsoever. What does it mean? I'll try to give an explanation. So in fact, all of us here, I assume, including myself, we are against this, we have nothing against plurality of cultures. Quite to the contrary, to some extent I pride myself in being versed in continental European cultures and languages. Certainly I admire people who speak different languages and who are well versed in be they myths or the historical memory of different peoples in Europe. However, it seems to me that our political class, not just here in Great Britain, but all elsewhere in Europe, let alone the United States of America, and most citizens use this word nowadays, multicultural, as a what? As a very elegant euphemism for multiracial society. Now, the word race, of course, is a scary word. As of recently, in France, you may probably be familiar, the word race disappeared from all legal documents. This is what even the President Hollande said a couple of months ago. So it legally doesn't exist. It's just a social construct. Biologically, there is no more race, okay? So be careful when you use the word race in France, because it can get you into problems sometimes. So anyway, the word multiculturalism seems to be in this newspeak, in this Orwellian newspeak, a construct that has become a nice alibi for our opinion makers, for our scribes, to cover the real racial reality of our system, however good or however bad it may be. Now, culture and education, of course, are deeply and closely intertwined in political process, and none of them can be convinced of separately. They go hand in hand. Now, as far as the education and the etymology of the word education is concerned, most of us know where it comes from. It comes from two different verbs. The first one is the Latin verb educare, which denotes the action of breeding animals or planting seeds. Okay, this is just one etymology, or taking care of plants in the field. And the second meaning, which is the more correct one, derives actually from the Latin verb educere, whose verbal root is duco ducere, which means literally to guide. You know, the Italian word duce means literally the theater, the conductor, the governor. So it was a common view among our ancestors, and this is something I need to look at briefly, that knowledge only dispensed by a sage, by an intelligent man, by a wise man, preferably an older man, can help a young man get the necessary veneer in strengthening his character and strengthening his soul. This was the original meaning of the word culture. Now, we can make a somewhat critical remark here, especially as far as some of my colleagues are concerned who deal with sociobiology and different IQs and so on. There is no question that heredity or race, or metaphorically speaking, nature, as crucial as it is in our identity building process, in my process for instance as well, and in our political behavior, is of very meager value unless accompanied by appropriate educational nurture. This almost sounds like a leftist rhetoric, but it's not quite. I'll explain it. I'm sure most of us have met very intelligent people, white people of high IQ, I've met lots of them, who are just simply lazy, who have a propensity. I don't know if it's a biological propensity or inborn genetic, probably deformation, but the fact of the matter is that even in my classes I've met students with really high IQ, great conceptual incisiveness, but unfortunately who are just damn lazy for the rest of their life, and they never succeeded in obtaining some trade and obtaining some paper, if I can put it that way. Conversely, I've also met people of our race, of our gene pool, of lower IQ, who, with even moderate skills, if committed to education, if they have the will to power, can sometimes come up with surprising results, and it can be of great benefit to our society. Real briefly, as far as education is concerned, in antiquity, we tackled on that. I enjoyed very much Adrian Davies' speech, and I presume mine will follow up on that a little bit. In ancient Greece, of course, let's keep in mind this education dispensed back then, let's say 2,500 years ago, was basically an oral culture. Oral in a sense that it was not transmitted in written form, because there were no books, there was very little documents left. So basically all those myths that we hear, all those sagas, and all those glorious battles around Troy and in Troy itself were basically transmitted through the word of mouth. The educational values held in high esteem in ancient Greece was the cultivation of body, and of course the cultivation of spirit and mind, and unquestionable readiness of sacrifice for one's community. Now, individualism, the way we conceive it here, specifically here in Great Britain and in the United States of America, was just considered a mental aberration. It just simply did not exist. First existed a city-state, a community, and only after that a man could develop his skills or his future, or engage in future activities. The Greek ideal of a good citizen, a good ruler, was later adopted by ancient Rome. The ancient Romans, they just changed the names, but the substance was more or less kept alive from ancient Greece. Each good patrician house in ancient Rome prided itself on having a slave scholar from Greece who instructed the patrician sons in the Greek language and in ancient Greek myths. Now, the way they call them, somewhat in a derisive fashion and somewhat pejorative fashion, they call them Greculi, which is a little bit funny, like Greculi. It sounds like those petty little Greeks, they will take care of my sons. So let's try to sort of transpose ourselves into the mindset of those people 2,000 years ago. I know it takes time, it takes a great deal of reading, but it can be done, I'm sure. During the Middle Ages, and it was already mentioned by the first speaker today, and until the Renaissance of the late 15th century, but even much longer, the Church, specifically the Catholic Church, played a crucial role in education, right? Educating European citizens. Let's just keep in mind that 99% of people were illiterate. They just didn't write. Even Charlemagne today, he couldn't write himself. Often a clergyman, and this was a practice that remained alive, well, almost until relatively recently. A clergyman was a statesman and the other way around. Now, one thing we also need to mention, that there's a dispute between the clergy and more secular-minded citizens, not necessarily atheists, please. Back in the late medieval times in ancient Italy, well, Italy didn't exist back then, there were different statelets over there. There was a pretty severe dispute and also physical there was war going on between the so-called Ghibellines and the so-called Guelphs. The Ghibellines demanding a more secular imperial rule, whereas the Guelphs advocated a stronger papal role, a stronger clerical role in education and, of course, in the political process. To some extent, if I can just draw a certain parallel with some of the Eurosceptics vis-à-vis Europeanists, as I call them. Now, indeed, there are quite a few citizens, including myself, who certainly would be very appreciative of some inclusion of some clause in the legal documents of the European Union, which would clearly state the Christian background of the European Union and our common European home, as they call it. But again, this may remind us a little bit of the same type of a dispute which raged in the medieval South Central Europe, particularly in the 13th century. Of course, we mentioned already Thomas Aquinas, whose work is viewed as an indispensable tool for good education and good scholarship, even nowadays. Now, let's be a little bit critical, if we may. We must also single out early religious orders, such as the early Catholic Benedictines. The Benedictines, as you certainly know, they came from Ireland and mostly from England back in the 7th and 8th century. And I'll tell you quite frankly, they don't have a good rating, particularly not in Germany. I'll try to explain why. Catholic Benedictines from England who had been active in proselytizing the pagans in continental Europe. Catholic schools and convents during the Middle Ages in continental Europe laid the foundations of what we call today modern education, a notion that still prevails among many, many conservative scholars. I presume also the gentlemen over there. Now, here's my critical remark, and I will try to give I'll try to back it up with some sources, with some empirical evidence. We should not forget that early education in Europe was carried out by the Catholic missionaries. Most of them came from England. I'm sure you all heard about Saint Boniface. It's a big hero of Europe. Everybody hails him, praises him high to sky. But Saint Boniface, in some of the works that I can refer you to, is considered as the first ethnic cleanser, the first Karadzic of Mladic, if you wish. Okay? He was abetted and aided by Christian Frankish rulers, First, the Emperor Charles Martel. We all enjoy, you know, my nationalist friends in Europe and in America, they love Charles Martel, but they often keep forgetting that Charles Martel and his grandson, Charlemagne, killed literally dozens and dozens of thousands of Saxons in the central, what is today central Germany, Frisians up north, not far from England, Wends, this is a Slavic tribe further to the east, Prussians as well, and of course the Slavs. So we can say that the spreading of education was carried out not just by the gospel, but also by sword and fire in a rather ugly fashion. Ad maiorem Dei gloriam, as they say, all in the good name of God. So in Germany, even nowadays, even if you talk to people who are not necessarily academics, they don't call Charlemagne Charles the Great, they call him Charles the Sachsenschlechter, Charles the butcher of the Saxons, because he killed quite a few of Saxon aristocracy approximately. I don't want to tinker with names, so although not with names or numbers, I'm always a little bit suspicious of numbers, regardless whether this is a contemporary history or ancient history. But apparently about 4,000 people of the best stock, of the best racial stock of Saxons who refused to be baptized were killed by Charlemagne. Now here is a quote by Robert Luft, Die Verchristung der Deutschen, the Christianizing of the Germans. Of course, keep in mind, as I said earlier, you always got to know exactly who published the book and when the book was published. The book was published, it's a very prominent scholar, Robert Luft, in Munich in 1937. There was a great deal of debate in the Weimar Germany, and of course during the Third Reich, among intellectual circles, to what extent Charlemagne should be used as a predecessor of this new Third Reich, or to what extent he was just a bad guy who destroyed the German law, common law, and who actually destroyed even racially or even genetically, who impoverished Central European peoples. Here is a quote, this is my rough translation. Such a rapid success could not be psychologically explained by the proselytizing of Saint Boniface, nor through the assistance of Holy Ghost, a little bit of sarcasm. It was only possible as a result of dreadful pressure on the state upon the subjected heathens. So this process of Christianizing Europe stretched approximately from the 5th century all the way to the 14th century in some Nordic countries and in Sweden, especially among Lithuanians. Christianity took hold only as late as the late 14th century. Another quote, I guess it's worth having a quick look at it. In the legal code, Capitulatio de Partibus Saxonia, which means literally the ordinance concerning Saxony of the late 8th century, 780 or something, Charlemagne made it quite clear that any pagan from Saxony must be put to death if he refuses to be baptized. Now, now I guess I don't want to now draw some subjective conclusions, but at least in my hindsight, in my experience, this does remind me a little bit of early Bolshevik ukazes that we experienced in 1917, 1918, and that I experienced as a boy back in communist Yugoslavia. So again, I don't want to draw those conclusions, I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, but we got to put things always in a wider perspective when we deal with culture and education. Now, I'm always trying to figure out what was crossing the mind of Swiss German peasants, because after all, there was a civil war. The Franks were also a Germanic tribe, but for a variety of reasons, with Clovis, they had adopted Christianity much earlier, in the 5th century already. Unlike most Germanic tribes in what is today continental Central Europe, they remained committed to their Alaris and Penates, to their own homely gods, we can say. Now, I'm trying to figure out why why those early tribes and those individuals, peasants mostly, could not identify with this new monotheistic mindset of Judaic and Levantine provenance. Let's keep it in mind. We can now, if I can digress a little bit, lambast Muslims and Islamists, whatever, for their quote-unquote Levantine Oriental barbarity, but let's also keep in mind that Christianity did not emerge here in Scotland, for that matter, or for that matter in Scandinavia. It emerged also in the Middle East, in the Levant. Now, what's important here, why I mentioned these quotations from this guy, Luft, exactly the same violent re-educational process, albeit on a more secular level, took place 1,200 years later, following World War II, during the so-called Anglo-American re-education process of the German people, and not just the German people, but other peoples who were either allies or who were friendly to the Axis in Central Europe and in Southern Europe. The consequences of that re-education can still be observed today in our modern educational process and, of course, in our political system, both among the victims and the victors of the Second World War. Now, as far as the period of modernity is concerned, we can roughly situate it at the 18th century. It stretches to 1945. It gave political birth, I'm sure you know that, to America, modern Europe, and later on to the communist Soviet Union. And we call this period the Age of Enlightenment. And in fact, in Germany, this period, period of Enlightenment is called as a pedagogical century, or we can translate it in a better English as educational century. Again, we are the progeny of this educational century because we still live in this Age of Enlightenment, although in its latter-day forms. Now, just before we start praising the enlightened thinkers in the American founding fathers and their courage in dethroning former religious and political lies and mendacities of former epochs, which were usually associated with the church, with the clerical education, we must also take into account that they were the products of their time. Most likely, if Thomas Jefferson or Washington, even George III, if you wish, if they had been born 200 years earlier or 200 years later, who knows, probably they would have been either the dissidents, or probably they would be somewhere in prison, or most likely, or another possibility is they would be part of the system. They would be probably teaching about LGTB or something else. So we always got to keep in mind that we are the products of the system of a given zeitgeist, but at the same time, if some of us have a modicum of free will and non-conformism, we also steer the historical process in a somewhat different fashion. We all have this ability because history is always open for all of us. Now, just as much the enlightened politicians of that time, especially in the United States of America and later on in France, just as much as they rid the society, their respective societies, of all those ancient myths and mythologies and mendacities, they institutionalized the new ones, which we now take for granted. And surprisingly, even our scholars in I'm talking about mainstream politically correct scholars, they never question those myths. And which are those myths? The myth of eternal progress. That's the one we live with. We always think that it's going to be much better tomorrow. We'll see how much better it will be next few years. And the myth of equality, we just take it for granted nowadays, all equality. And the worst one, in my view, my subjective view, the lack of the sense of the tragic. This is what our politicians and our educators and whatever our media people have completely lost. The lack of the sense of the tragic. Adrian Davies, again, I don't want to praise him again, but I need to mention, he mentioned the English romanticists, regardless of who they were, or on drugs and laudanum, or whoever. But the fact of the matter is, most of those English poets, and not just the English poets or the period of Romanticism, early 19th century, but also German poets, Central European poets, they had the sense of the tragic, which we don't. Okay. Now, the French Revolution, real fast, was the next political product of the Age of Enlightenment. Keep in mind, Thomas Jefferson, future president of the United States of America, was also the ambassador to royal France just prior to the French Revolution, where he actually had some contacts with the future revolutionaries during the Jacobin Revolution. So yes, indeed, the in a chronological matter, the American Revolution had a certain impact on the French revolutions because they happened in a subsequent fashion. Now, what's very surprising and puzzling for me is that the early French Jacobin, French revolutionaries, despite the fact that they were ultra-rationalists, They did adopt, however, quite a few of those Greek myths and Greek customs, ancient Greek myths, such for instance, the standard custom, the custom dress, custom attire was what they call a bonnet rouge, the red cap, the Phrygian cap, which basically can be traced back to ancient Greece, the Phrygian cap. And yes, indeed, the Spartan Moors, the Greek Moors, 2,000 years ago were highly praised in those Jacobin revolutionary school. Here's a little quote by, sure you're familiar with Saint-Just. He was one of those early guys, was 23 years of age, so quite fanatic, well fanatic, but idealist in his own way. He wrote the following, my short translation. Children belong to their mother up to 5 years of age, if she can feed them, and then to the republic until their death. The child and the citizen, they both belong to the homeland. Common education is necessary. Discipline of children must be rigorous. Of course, it sounds very authoritarian and very totalitarian, although as I said at the beginning, we've got to be very, very careful with these words authoritarian and totalitarian, because I prefer to see kids be a little bit more disciplined and self-disciplined in English school today than what they're doing right now. My first conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, the French revolutionary experiment was brought to its peak during the Bolshevik Revolution 170 years later in the Soviet Union. The legacy of the French and American and Soviet Revolution, however, albeit in a modified fashion, continues to be the backbone of our modern education today. I think I'm not running out of time. Okay, I'm always a little bit... All right, now, I hate to make digressions and talk about the fascist education. Again, before I do that, I'm trying to use value-neutral wordings and words, because, as I said a while ago, words, the signifier fascism has obtained such a signifier, has obtained such a signified that it has become totally obsolete. In fact, fascism nowadays is used as a symbol of absolute evil, of the evil of all evils. So even if you start your discussion on some aspects of the fascist life or National Socialist life in Germany, be it whatever the working conditions or the social conditions or the medical conditions, there's always something in the back of our minds that reminds us, because of our propaganda on a daily basis, that reminds us of something ugly, something bad, something surreal, something extraterrestrial. So this is not a scholarly approach to it. And I will tell you personally, as a former professor of course, that much of the stuff written on this period, be it in England, be it in America, quote-unquote, what they call it, academic stuff, footnoted stuff, deserves to be in the trash, in the garbage bin.
Yes.
I mean, I have my own principles. I think myself that one cannot study this period unless one fluently, really masterfully understands the nuances of the German language. And not only that, unless a person also has access to all this material. And keep in mind, lots of those books, we're talking thousands of books, are still not available for exploring and examining this particular topic of education. Now, public schools, universities, both in the National Socialist Germany and in Fascist Italy, were largely secular. The educational role of the Christian clergy in National Socialist Germany was far less prominent than in other affiliated pro-fascist countries in Europe of the time. Religious affiliation of students in National Socialist Germany had no role whatsoever in building their national consciousness, which was largely determined by their ancestry and by their race. Ancestry is also important. There were students in the Third Reich, 1933 until 1939 approximately, who came from pagan, heathen, Protestant, agnostic, and Catholic homes. By contrast, of course, you're familiar with that, sects and cults such as Jehovah's Witnesses and Christian Mormons, they were banned. They were not allowed to function both legally or educationally in the Third Reich. In the educational process of other friendly Axis countries, however, notably Spain, it was mentioned here, Hungary, Croatia, of course, Belgium or Slovakia, the educational role of Catholic schools was very, very prominent, unlike in Germany and Allied Germany. And indeed, many of those educators, Catholic educators in Spain, let's say early 40s or late 30s, or in Croatia and Belgium, 41, 42, and so on, had a very prominent role, not just in the educational process, but also in the political process. Now, both National Socialist Germany and Fascist Italy, irrespective of the fact that they were signatories of the Concordat, had frequent diplomatic tensions with the Vatican on the official level, especially regarding their teachings on race, a curriculum considered contrary to the ecumenical and multiracial teachings of the Church. You remember this famous encyclica by the Pope, I think it was in 38, I'm sure, I'm forgetting that, in which he explicitly bans the racial differences among peoples, which was certainly not to the credit of National Socialist Germany. Now, hostility to race was of no big help to the Catholic clergy in Eastern Europe, and I'm talking now from my own experience, after the communist takeover in 1945. So again, keep in mind these are fascist, pseudo-fascist friendly countries allied with National Socialist Germany, which had quite a different educational policies for high school and in the graduate studies as well. Then those countries which were very much, we can say, papal and Vatican prone. The prime target, however, of the communists once they took over power in 1945, from the Baltics all the way down to the Balkans, was the so-called clerofascists. This is the cluster word, the compound word that you will probably not find in the English language, but it is very common in the communist vernacular. So I remember as a boy, and even in Germany, they use it, clerofascismus, you know. We have to fight, this is what the communist hacks were talking about. We have to fight the clerofascists, which if you look at from the ideological perspective is a misnomer, because fascism and clericalism have nothing in common. Mussolini himself was not a religious person, well, religious in the Catholic sense and so on. Now, the only exception, which is probably striking, is that the communist Poland, despite the fact that it was taken over by communists and occupied by the Soviets, did preserve, to a large extent, its Catholic education, unlike any other country in Eastern Europe, unlike Slovakia, unlike Hungary, unlike Croatia. Croatia suffered real badly for obvious reasons. Over 800 priests and nuns were killed in 1945. So certainly Poland must be singled out as a sole exception in the communist universe in terms of allowing Catholic education side by side with the public state-sponsored socialist education. Real briefly, ladies and gentlemen, I guess it's rather important, the year 45 was not just a catastrophe for the vanquished whites, but also for the winning whites. The trial of Nuremberg laid the legal foundations for the New World Order, which has remained intact up until now. So if you want to study political correctness, if you want to study modern discourse and the masters of new discourse, even our legal system, even the different legislations, be it in France, particularly the penal code, it all harks back to the Nuremberg trial and to the Treaty of London in 45. The so-called period of post-war political denazification has ever since been going on hand in hand with the process of re-education, and it's still going on. Every German citizen knows very well the ominous meaning of the German word Umerziehung. This is a very strong word in the German language. Literally it means re-education, but it doesn't have such a strong psychological impact, or rather, and resonance in the English language as it does in the German language. You know, people always sort of stand back a little bit in German when you use the word Umerziehung, which means literally re-education, but as I said, it has a much stronger role, much stronger impact, much stronger resonance. Immediately after the World War II, just a few data, public servants, teachers, and academics born before 1928, talking specifically about Germany, 28, so who were more than 17 years of age, who were 18 and more, had to fill out the Allied questionnaires, consisting of 130 questions, prodding them on their ties with former National Socialist Germany, their religious affiliations, their marital status, their sexual life, etc. It's translated, this is a famous German author, conservative revolutionary Ernest von Salomon. It's not a Jewish name, Salomon. It's actually he's of Protestant Huguenot origin. He passed away a long time ago. And he wrote a book, Fragebogen, the Fragebogen, which means literally the questionnaires. And those questionnaires were administered by the British authorities, by the English, and by the American authorities in Germany, in the vanquished or occupied or free Germany, whichever way you want to call it, shortly after before the Nuremberg trials. And according to those questionnaires, the US and British occupying authorities in Germany classified all intellectual suspects into 3 categories. First, NS, National Socialist Party members, National Socialist sympathizers, and National Socialist fellow travelers. In most cases, teachers and public servants who were grilled by the Allied investigators were banned from holding jobs in public sector and from teaching courses. And I could give you at least 24 examples of people, of prominent scholars who lost their job. They were not shipped to the Gulag, they were not killed, they were not tried in Nuremberg, but they lost their jobs simply because they had some ties with the former defeated regime. In addition, and this is something which needs to be also looked at, thousands of scholarly books, especially those from the fields of genetics, anthropology, hereditary, and of course books dealing with the Jewish questions, were simply banned or removed from library shelves or taken overseas. I'd be surprised every time I want to do something serious, I don't find those books in Germany. I have to go to America, to any library. Through interlibrary loan, you can find some very interesting books. That simply are not allowed, for obvious reasons, for legal reasons, to be disseminated in Germany. And to some extent also here in the UK. Now, of course, this is the cliche. What comes to our mind is the famed Frankfurt School, and of course many Jewish academics from the Frankfurt School who returned from the USA to Germany after the war. Of course they played a significant role in re-educating the German future elites. But this is just a tip of the iceberg, ladies and gentlemen. Let's not forget that most of those Jewish scholars, be it Adorno, Horkheimer, and so on, Marcuse, they also had personal scores to settle with their German colleagues who remained loyal to the National Social regime. Or you know how academics are. There's always a little bit of publish and perish, a little bit of jealousy and what have you. So they thought, now it's our time. Now we got to write the canons of democracy and canons of political correctness for the German people because we're expelled here. So that's what history is all about. But let us not forget the name of John Dewey, the American scholar, who was also a big-time re-educator in post-war Germany and Italy as well, and who institutionalized the new method of, quote, progressive education in teaching students. Not just teaching democratic canons in politics, but also democratic behavior in the daily life of students. Of course, we should not leave out literally plane loads or truckloads of Bible preachers, Christian preachers from America, who were flown by Truman, President Truman, in 45, 46, 47, to Japan, to Austria, Italy, and especially Germany, in order to revamp and re-educate, re-civilize the mind of those European and Japanese barbarians. It was a standard type of a cliche at that time. Now, this should not come as a surprise, ladies and gentlemen, at all, because a similar, although on a much lower scale, similar method of re-education we saw recently in Iraq and Afghanistan, preaching democracy, preaching human rights, preaching some abstract concepts about multicultural conviviality. We hear it on a daily basis. Now we take it sometimes, unfortunately, for granted, even if we are critical. But by and large, this is the product that stems to a large extent from the United States of America and people, their allies, lackeys, if you wish, here from Europe. Now, to some extent, I'm also observing that in Eastern Europe, there are also not just government-sponsored, but of course, they're government-sponsored American schools and semi-schools, different agencies. You can guess what type of agencies. They're quite active in revamping the mind of post-communist youth. I'm sure you have heard of George Soros. George Soros is quite prominent in Budapest, in Hungary. And he actually has a certain clout, not just a financial clout, but he also has a clout in meta-politics, in deciding what's going to be said and what's going to be taught in terms of courses. So let's go slowly. Do I have stuff? Okay. I will now start with my conclusion. Although the prime goal of post-World War re-educators was to revamp the mind of the German people, ironically, the same process spilled over with full force into the schools of the victors. American and British high schools today and college students have been no less exposed to the latter-day Allied education than their counterparts in continental Europe. The content of their curriculum is virtually the same. One can notice, though, a basic decline in the study of classics and the decline in the discipline among students. Content-wise, that's important, one must single out the relatively new and forceful introduction of mandatory courses today, both in high schools and graduate schools, notably the study of the Holocaust and gender studies. Teaching of these courses should not come as a surprise, as they both reflect the educational climate following World War II. As far as modern gender studies are concerned, the dynamics of the egalitarian dogma, which has become the founding myth of the modern West today, has arrived at its logical conclusion. The widespread belief that all humans, all peoples, all races, all groups, all genders are interchangeable means also that they're expandable. Young students in America, in Britain, or here in Europe, under cover of some fictitious freedom of choice, are encouraged to tinker, temper, and even consider changing their race, their nation, and their sex. Ironically, in just 2 more minutes, the Marxist buzzword, workers of the world unite, having become obsolete and funny, even for the former Marxist hacks, has to be replaced by a very logical cliche, namely, gays and lesbians of the world unite. Because it fits perfectly into this egalitarian type of a dogma. It didn't work with the muscle proletarian and with his hammer and sickle. Let's do it now with those pictures of those Negro black kids, always they're constantly effeminate, they're constantly hungry, those people. I sometimes wonder, they always hold a little cup, they're always hungry, those black kids. And of course lesbians with their colors and so on. This is a new iconography, this is a topic I certainly would love to tackle on. Just what's the new media icons and iconography in our modern educational propaganda? In my final conclusion, real fast, we must agree that the foundation of the modern multicultural, stateless, rootless, and raceless system is the logical outcome of the end of the World War II. The multicultural system in which we all live today was not a chance result of a wicked person or some crazy conspiracy theory. Not at all. It was a well-planned and logical outcome of the belief in progress and equality. So again, I guess I'm pretty much done. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I could go on and on for hours.